Good evening and welcome to Artist Talk on Art. I'm Doug Shear, ATOA President. This evening, Monday, April 18th, 2022, features a legacy replay of a November 3rd, 2000 recording called The Figure, Another Side of Modernism. The panel was moderated by the independent curator, Lilly Wei, with artists Inka Essenhigh, Al Leslie, Joan Semmel, and Alfredo Arcia. The copyrighted screening is made possible by permission of Archives of American Art of the Smithsonian and is a part of the large ATOA archive that resides there in Washington. Join us next week, next Monday, the 25th, for an open studio. That's a format we use where artists can screen work and get immediate feedback from their peers. I think you might enjoy it. And I hope you will enjoy this replay of one of our early events.
Have been planning our second annual auction that's coming up this spring, March 2001, and we're getting together a committee, and we're holding our third meeting on November the 13th, which is a Monday at 7 p.m. at the ATOA office, if you're interested in joining, and I encourage all to do so because it's great, it's a lot of fun. Please talk to me after the panel this evening. And finally, to introduce our panelists, this evening we're having The Figure, Another Side of Modernism, which was organized by Fran Kornfeld, thank you. And it's an exhibition based on the Newhouse Center for Contemporary Art at Snug Harbor. And the panelists are Al Leslie, Joan Semmel, James Sheen, and Robin Tews, with moderator Lilly Wei. So without further delay, welcome. Okay.
Oh, what? I'm confused. I think. Can I use this mic? Can you hear me? No. How about? I'm sitting in a very awkward position here. I'm going to fall off the chair, and that will be part of the performance for the night. Anyway, my name is Lilly Wei. I think the names are pretty well expressed here. And I am the curator for The Figure, Another Side of Modernism, which is a show that is presently on view at Snug Harbor Cultural Center in Staten Island. For those of you who haven't been there or who haven't ever been to Snug Harbor, it's really not that far away, though it sounds like it's far away. It's a very pleasant ferry ride, and there's only a very short little bus ride to this fabulous place at the end. And for the artists who are in the show, of course, are here tonight. And the show consists of 125 painters from 1950 to the present. And again, I thought I would just give you a little taste of what some of these paintings are. So perhaps you can run these slides. It's just a preview, a trailer before, to give you a context within the context of the four artists. That didn't come out quite right, but you meant the context for them and their work too, so you have an idea of what is available. This, of course, is just a sample, so. Do I really have to get up? I guess.
If you want to advance the slides, there's a plastic cord on the microphone itself. You see it there with a little...
Here?
Please.
The white button.
Okay. Well, anyway, this is Fairfield Porter's portrait of Jane Wilson. I think it's called Jane Wilson in Red, and it's from 1957. And you can notice actually how respectable this portrait is. I mean, if I can use that word in quotes. And then next, this is a painting, an enamel nude painting by David Smith, from 1964. I don't know how familiar you are with these late works of David Smith, the sort of the arch abstract sculptor of the century. But they just had a show of these works at Gagosian, and he made an extensive study of the nude in his last 2 years. And this is from 1964, if I haven't said that. This is Mel Ramos's Devil's Dog from around 1963, 64 too. I think this is kind of a 60s, this is 60s attitude, right? So this is Pop. Here we have Philip Pearlstein's nude on a Keeling rug from 1969, I believe. And just to keep it in mind when you compare it with Joan Semmel's nude, which we'll look at later, which she will show. The idea of the male gaze, perhaps, versus the female gaze. This is a self-portrait of Jim Dine. This is how men looked in 1964, perhaps. It's not quite Armani, but anyway, it's a quite wonderful work. And here's another self-portrait. This is by Brenda Goodman from 1994. So we just upped 30 years. You know, it's very hard sometimes to recognize artists from their self-portraits. Yes, luckily. And here's another wonderful self-portrait by Susannah Coffey, which is from 1998. It's very small, but it's so intense. This is a self-portrait by Julie Heffernan, again in 1998, I think. It's called Self-Portrait as Mother/Child. Now, here's a portrait by Alex Katz of Ada with superb Lilly, and this is from 1967. You know, portraits are often as much a portrait of their period as they are of a person, and often they are as much a portrait of the artist as they are of the subject. Whoops, how did I do that? Well, can you go back? That's a proto-Basilitz. We're on our, you know. This is Alice Neal's portrait of Jane Wilson and her family, John Gruen and her daughter Julia. Just again to kind of point out the difference between Alice Neal's version of Jane Wilson and Fairfield Porter's. It's worlds apart, isn't it? Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. That detail we just saw was Catherine Murphy's portrait, perhaps. It's called 2 Feet, Ben Bush. So the whole speaks, or the part speaks for the whole. And next one is John Wesley's 1997 sofa, it's called. So maybe it's a portrait of a sofa. And, you know, they're actually in the same room together. I kind of like the fact that there was feet and then no feet. So this is sort of makes up for her lack of feet. This is Carl Ostendarp's, it's called My Wife's Relations, which he said was a title taken from a Buster Keaton film. So perhaps this is his portrait of, actually, I think, himself, you know, vis-a-vis his relation to his wife's relations. But in any case, it's like the hand of God or something coming down from a medieval painting. These are all 90s. And this is a portrait by Brenda Zlamani, who does a series of portraits of artists and her friends, who are mostly artists. And she's doing a portrait of the, again, the ultimate portraitist. This is Chuck Close, of course. And this is from 1999. So, and then perhaps looking at some work that might stretch the notion of figuration a bit, or however one wants to define it these days. This is a 1961 Great American Nude by Tom Wesselman. It's number 12, so it's fairly early in the series, and it's rather abstract, as you can see. This is Katherine Bradford's Woman in the Water. It's from 1997, and I think it started out as a bridge. So you can, again, this notion of what is exactly figuration. And this is Amanda Church's Triumphator, which is, she thinks of herself more as an abstract painter at times, and now she's beginning to wonder. But anyway, I think of it as a kind of, friendly, coquettish Casper or something, the ghost. But certainly it has personality, however you might want to define it. And then here's Eugène Leroy, who recently died at a very ripe age. Is his 1994 painting called Atelier, where the nude is pretty well hidden, but is behind, or submerged in all those skeins of paint. And then we have Byron Kim's Flesh. I thought, as I said, we should push this notion of what is abstraction and what is figuration. And here it is, a portrait of skin tones or of flesh. So, what's here? I was going to show the four slides of the show of the paintings that the artists here tonight had in the show, but I only had 2 of them, so I do think you'll see the others in their collection. But, well, this is Joan Semmel, but I would start off with Al Leslie. His was Linda B. Cross, which is an enormous 9-foot by 6-foot painting of a solitary figure in grisaille called Linda B. Cross, which he will tell us about, and it's enormous. And then we have Joan Semmel's Antonio and I from 1974. And then I don't have one of Robert Hughes, but I have this of James Sheehan, and it's called Bored, and it's, as you can see, it's a scene of people at a pool, and you can't get it in slide form, but the scale between Al Leslie, who has one of the largest paintings, and it is of a single figure, and you have of James Sheehan, who has probably the most figures of any painter in the show, and it's on a 2.5 inch, well, maybe 2 1/4 by 2.5 inch format. So anyway, that's part of the range. Okay. So what?
You want to go on to those? Or?
Well, this is Alfred Leslie is going to start. I just thought I would introduce Alfred Leslie briefly. Maybe I should just introduce the panel. I don't want to go lights off, lights on. Should I just introduce the panel all at once?
No, I think so.
No, I should do it separately.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm cooperative. All right. Okay. So Alfred Leslie, who, as I said, is perhaps best known for his monumental grisaille paintings of one figure that are usually framed from the top of the head to the fingertips. He has shown extensively throughout the United States and abroad. His solo museum exhibits include the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Hirshhorn Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Butler Institute, the Worcester Art Museum, the St. Louis Art Museum, the Stockholm Kunsthall. He has participated in also in many group exhibitions at the Whitney, the Guggenheim, the Museum of Modern Art, the Walker Art Center, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. Alfred Leslie is also a filmmaker, although many of the films he made were destroyed by a devastating studio fire in 1966. Recently, Pull My Daisy, a film which he made with Robert Frank and Jack Kerouac in 1959 was aired on PBS. So, okay, Alfred Leslie.
Show my slide now?
What? Yes, would you please show your slides now? Seen from the point of view of looking down, as she put it. So looking down the body. Some of her most recent shows have been a group show at Matthew Marks, curated by Robert Gober, a retrospective at Guild Hall in East Hampton, a solo show at Mitchell Algus, and a large show of paintings at the Jersey City Museum, which featured some of her recent mannequin paintings. She is the recipient of several awards, including 2 National Endowment of the Arts Awards, and Joan teaches at Rutgers University at the Mason Gross School of the Arts.
Just retired.
Just retired.
Okay, I didn't bring along any of the abstract works, of which I had a full career showing those works when I lived in Europe. And I came back to this country in 1970 and immediately started working from the figure again. So I'll start there, and this is in 1973. And my works I tend to work in series, so that there'll be about 20 paintings to 30 paintings of a particular idea, and then I'll move on. And what I brought along tonight are 1 or 2 examples from a few of these series since the 1970s. This is 1973. It's 70 inches by 70 inches large, so you get an idea of the scale. All of my work with the figure has been from photographs, of which I take myself, and then I do whatever it is I do to change things and make it into my own painting. This is the one that's in the show. It's called Antonio and I, and it's 78 inches wide, I believe. No, I'm sorry, it's 96. It's a different one. This is the piece that was in the show that Robert Gober curated at Matthew Marks. It's called Intimacy, Autonomy. It's interesting that Al talked about the different horizon lines. I collaged the 2 figures together from 2 separate photographs because I wanted them each to have their own disappearing point. So that the idea, the conceptual idea of autonomy was carried through plastically also. This piece I call Me Without Mirrors. It's in the Greenville County Museum, South Carolina, and it's from that whole self-image series, about 1977, I believe. This piece was done in 1976, and it was done for a particular show. I was showing at Lerner Hella Gallery at the time, and he was doing a show that was called a patriotic show. It was supposed to be a political show that was critical, and I wanted one of my pieces to be in it. And at the time I was doing the self-images, and he said, well, how am I going to show this as political work? I'll have to stand up there and give a lecture for you. And I said, well, I'll paint you a diagram. So I did this piece, and the center panel in it is one of the self-images that I was that part of that series. And then the panel on the right was a parody of the de Kooning, one of the de Kooning women paintings, and the panel on the left came from a Playboy magazine, and I called the piece Mythologies and Me. After I did that painting, I became intrigued with the idea of juxtaposing different styles. I really liked the possibility of doing that. And so I started a series that I called the Echoing Images. And one of the image came directly from the self-photograph, and then the echoing image was a way of carrying it into a more painterly and more abstract mode. This one is called Focus. And this is another one from that series. They're very large. They're approximately 10 feet wide. This is jumping quite a long time. I didn't want to confuse the issue with too many different things, so I brought the next big, large series that came about 10 years later. There were several series of portraits and of other beach pictures and so on. But this is the next one which I feel takes off in an area that had not been really done by other people very much. And it was a whole series that I did of women in the locker room. And this one is called The Changing Room, and it's a diptych painting that's 82 inches high. So the width of it, I don't remember exactly, but you can judge the scale. And this is one of the last ones from that series, which I call Mask. It's interesting because when I worked those paintings, I tried to get the photographs I got permission from the people to use it, but I did not want them to be posing to the mirror or to be aware of the viewer. I wanted them the pictures to feel natural. So I started taking the pictures in the mirror in trying to get them to be unaware of me taking the pictures. And what happened was that, of course, I got myself in the picture also. So I rather like that because it tied up with some of my earlier ideas about the self-image, but it also was interesting that the camera then was pointed out at the viewer. So the position of who's the viewer and who's the viewed becomes ambiguous, and I rather like that whole kind of play. After the Locker Room series, which I showed in the 1980s, I went back and looked over some of my earlier work, and I took some of the early erotic paintings and I sacrificed a few of them to combine them with some of the images that I had gotten from the Locker Room. So here, for instance, you see part of the earlier erotic series with an image from the Locker Room thrown over it. It's called Greenfield, and it's 68 by 68 inches high. And this is another one. These series I called the overlays, and they are all images with other images laid over them. And in this one, the first time, some of the mannequin images appeared, because what I was doing is I used up images very quickly in these canvases, and I was sort of scouting around the neighborhood with the camera all the time, looking for things that interest me. And I found these mannequins in the store window, and they intrigued me, and I overlaid them over this self-image, which had hair which turned into the kind of Medusa snakes. So I like the whole idea of the old myth of the Medusa, of the woman who was so ugly that men turned to stone when they looked at her. And the other image in the lower right-hand part was, there were some posters up in Soho at the time of Aryan art, of the kind of fascist images. And the figure holding the sword, of course, is one of those images in stone. So the myth of the Medusa is of Perseus cutting off her head, but here the male image has already been turned to stone, even though he holds the sword. So I like the kind of play that all of these different allusions brought in, even though I know that you need a map to read them. For me, it set off the painting. And this was one of the images that I got in that scouting in the Soho area. And, but I rather liked the overlay of images that I got directly from the photograph. And I started to feel that I got more impact working that way than working with multiple images overlaid. And here I call this Soho Display. And it is, of course, a storefront window with a group of mannequins in the window and the reflections on the window. So that was the first of the mannequin pictures, and I picked up on the mannequins that was in that earlier work and started to work them more directly, and have done this whole series of mannequins which were showed at the Jersey City Museum, and 2 of them will be in a show over in Brooklyn that opens tomorrow, and this is another one of those pictures. It's called Hot Lips. And this is another. And this, another. These are all quite large pictures. This one I call Sisters. And this is a very small picture from the mannequin series, and I like it a lot also because it plays back to some of the earlier self-images in a strange way. Robin.
Robin Tews is represented by Bill Main's gallery, where she has had many one-person and group exhibitions. She is shown at PPOW at Christine Rose Gallery, the Workspace, White Columns, Art in General, John Weber Gallery, the Whitney Museum, the Drawing Center, the Aldridge Museum, the Alternative Museum, PS1, PS122, among other venues. Her awards have included grants from the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and an award from the Artist Space. Robin lectures extensively and has been a visiting artist at the Corcoran, at Cranbrook, at UCLA, at Yale, University of Massachusetts, Boston University, and Middlebury College. She teaches at Bard College in the MFA program. I'm homeless. I'm seatless.
This painting was done. This painting was done last year. It's titled "I Love Mommy, I Love Daddy." My paintings are pretty small. They're 18 by 24, a little larger, a little smaller. I used to work very large, and I think it was sort of a conscious decision, and maybe a reaction to what was going on in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, that the only kind of painting, an only real painting is a large painting with a lot of paint and with no image on it at all. And I've always worked with images, and so I've also gravitated to the image being smaller, because for me it serves a purpose, because I want them to look kind of very ordinary and very recognizable and kind of very harmless. And when you go up close, because they're small, you need to go up close. There's a lot of detail in them that you don't see when you look far away, and a lot of the detail has to do with the writing on the wall, and that's a large part of the work. So it's, unfortunately, you can't see it in the slides, but on the walls it reads things like, the painting is called I Love Mommy, I Love Daddy, and it's every other weekend, Tuesday nights, on Daddy's birthdays, on Christmas holidays, and it's a litany of separating the time between a child of a separated parents, which is something that's kind of quite more and more common. And I use my son, Dylan, that's my son there, but he's really made to be like sort of a generic kind of image, or a child. The next one's called Suburban Orpheus. I usually work with, I'll take pictures too, or I'll find images like in magazines, or usually a blank room. And what I do when I see that room and I get a certain feeling from it, I may not know what I'm going to do right then, but I kind of put it aside and live with it for a while, and then I strip it bare. I sort of take everything out and I put in it what comes to mind in terms of it. So it starts off as sometimes a picture of a cluttered room stripped bare, and it's just really a box, so that it's like a container. And from that container, I fill things and take things out and put other things in. And there's like the image of the plants. You can see a profile in the shadows. The shadows play a lot in talking about what's going on with the images or not. And when I started painting these rooms, I used to paint people a lot, and then they came out of the rooms because I just felt I had to look at the room in another way. And so now when I put the people back in, the chairs, because I had no people in them, the chairs and the objects in the room, I gave them kind of an attention that I would have given the image, and they had some kind of a life that came inside of them that didn't happen if they were filled with people. So this painting's called I'm Not Home Right Now. And on the wall, up in the top, it's hard to see. It's different. The words are different colored. I usually scratch in from the surface underneath, and it's bits and pieces and fragments from a conversation that a child might be lying in a parent's bedroom or any bedroom and hear in the corner of their mind. So a lot of the paintings that I do are about sort of those fleeting moments, or we have so many inundated with so many images and ideas and words and thoughts that we see things in the corner of our eye, and we absorb it in that way. We walk down the street. There'd be people. Now there's people talking on the cell phone. You used to think they were crazy, but now they're just talking. You used to be able to. Now, there's so much noise and action and imagery that I think that's why I strip things bare and just put back in what I want. So this is about that kind of him hearing fragments on a conversation on the phone, and it would say, like, on the wall, "What? He said what? No, I didn't do that. How the hell am I supposed to know that?" Or, "Oh, really? I put it on underneath the table." All these kind of unconnected things that he may put together in his mind and create another story with. This one's in the show at Snug Harbor. It's called What's So Funny? And on the rug, you cannot see it, but it's made to look like a pattern, and the word says ha 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 ha. But from a distance, it looks like a pattern, and I like to do that with the words or images that I put on the walls. And then you go up close, and there's another thing going on. And this one's called I'm Naked, You're Not. This is from my short dating experience in between relationships. I'm enjoying myself right now. But that's so, it's not really, it's a sort of it's not a self-portrait of me, but it is about they're all about sort of experiences that I hope are a universal experience, because I do think that no matter what we go through, we all kind of go through the same thing. We'll eventually all feel the same things and experience the same things. It may have a different setting, so that's what my work is about, kind of capturing that universal place, hopefully. And this one's called Solitary Confinement. And I was reading an article, I can't remember right now, but about how when you're a young child, and if you've been nurtured by your mother in a way that was satisfying, you're able to be in the world as an adult alone and enjoy the feeling of being alone. And I was thinking about how important that is to be a painter. You spend so much time being alone, or in a lot of professions, but so this is about that kind of idea, and it's also talking about who inspires what, where does an idea come from, the fact that these paintings are camouflaged, This one's called Not for Nothing, and this came out of, I was asked to be in a show about Marilyn Monroe and to do a piece about her. And I don't really think about Marilyn Monroe, but sometimes when you're asked to be in these kind of situations do a work for a specific idea for a show, I really love it because it focuses you in a way that you wouldn't really do otherwise. And some of my favorite paintings that I enjoyed doing came from that kind of a situation. But so this one I was thinking about three women that I knew: Marilyn Monroe, who died tragically, and my sister Melanie, who was posed like that over the bed, and my cousin, who had recently passed away, and their lives, and how Marilyn Monroe sort of, looking at her position, and I thought about Marilyn Monroe's sort of vulnerability and her fragility, and how, compared to Melanie's, my sister's, posturing on the couch, the connection or the freedom that almost her vulnerability gave her, or women, to be able to pose in such a way, and what that means. And this one's called "You Don't Love Me." And on the wall is a litany of words that have to do with like obsessional, neurotic kind of love, nothing to do with love, really, like, I need you, I desire you, I can't live without you, you make me crazy, I'm going to live without you. And it's called "You Don't Love Me." Oh, this is an old one. I didn't realize to put it. This one's called, it's called "Normal Girl Seeks Normal Boy." And there was these, I was looking through those ads, those personal ads in the back of one of those magazines. They have the greatest titles. They're so wacky, and it kind of inspired. Like Joan was saying, I too like to work at a series. So this came from a series of paintings that had to do with, this time, these texts that I read, these titles. So then this was done, must have been early, mid-90s. I think that's it. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This one came from another series idea where I wanted to do a series of paintings that had to do with being inside monasteries or churches or something like that. So I went to a nunnery with Nina, and we stayed at this place uptown on the Upper West Side, and it was this nun hangout. It was very interesting and strange, and it was nothing like I thought it would be. It was sort of very interesting. So that's one of the rooms from the nunnery. It's been changed, of course. And the painting's called "Fuck Me, Fuck You." And that side of the wall it says "Fuck Me," all written on there, and that side it says "Fuck You." That's what came out of that. I think that's it.
Maybe I'll try this one. James Sheehan comes from the San Francisco Bay Area. He has lived and worked in New York City for the past 6 years, and he has exhibited his paintings in solo and group shows in several venues in the city, such as Art in General, Murray Guy, and Joseph Rickards. He has also recently had solo shows in Montreal and Zurich. He is painting at the moment both large and small scale works using size, he says, not simply to play with scale, but as a serious contemplation of a kind of temporal space, striving to fuse a symbiotic relationship between the conceptual underpinnings within a single image and that of the painting's physical painted surface. And I'll let him explain that remark to you. Okay. James.
So where's my clicker?
It's right on the thing. So, excuse me again. It was on the ground. There it is on the floor. See? That's it. Yeah.
Okay. This is the piece that's in the show. It's called Bored, and I like the title to be a little seemingly narrative, but have it kind of have its own life, as separated from the painting. So I'm not going to explain it. I'm just going to call it what it is. And I should give reference to the size. The size is basically 2 inches by 2 inches, and it's embedded in the wall. And I like to have a lot of space around it because I feel that it kind of works off the architecture better that way. And so this is really no way to really view the painting in a slide so huge like this. So I'm just going to have to explain kind of the context of approaching it, because I feel like most of my work is about how you approach something and kind of enter into a kind of microcosmic universe. And so this is about 3 or 4 years old, and it took me about a couple years to finish. I usually labor over things pretty intensely. This is a detail that I took with a microscope. So that gives you a little evidence of the scale, but I thought it looked pretty cool. This is actually a lot smaller. It's only 1 inch by 1 inch. And I call this which is the name of the mountain that's actually behind it. And this is from my upbringing as a kid in San Jose, California. And I'm in there, as well as my 2 brothers. And it started out to be just a really simple thing about a field of color, this light blue, which was our swim team color, and flesh. But as I started to realize that they were becoming individual portraits, it got a little more vast as an enterprise, and so it took me quite a while, and my skill had to be enhanced to get to that level. But this took me about 4 months, and I was pleased with it. This is all these works are kind of, the first 4 slides I have are about these kind of very large, vast spaces that have these really condensed situations. This is the Plastic Concorde with the trucker strike that happened about 4 years ago. They were able to shut down the country by parking their trucks inside these circular roundabouts, which did actually shut down the country. And such a charged political event, I thought was really beautiful as like kind of political content, but at the same time as a poetic kind of graphic image, being about 2 inches by 2 inches. It has a little punch. So the title of this is Fuck You. Yeah, this is title Fuck You. I'm sorry. So I'll leave that to you. And then along with the same title, this is called Three Fuckers. And so I'm being a little coy with the titles, but I leave that all up to you, the imagination. The next couple slides are work that is more kind of generally specific to the figure. And I try to draw in a lot of kind of heavy, compacted imagery just to kind of draw you in. And inevitably, I would hope this to be a very painterly experience when you start trying to figure out what is actually going on. Because this is so large, you kind of get to see what's going on pretty easily. But when it's reduced down to 2 inches, that becomes more of a private, intimate experience. This one's called Health Nor Faith. And this is kind of an homage to my dad and I going to San Francisco football games. And this is a moment where the receiver has not quite sure whether he has actually caught the ball or he's not. And so it's kind of a grand moment in sports, but I'm not a very sports-oriented person, but the idea of the spectacle was just overwhelming and a great excuse to paint red and white. This is my self-portrait, my first one. It's called Self-Portrait During a Tragedy at Sea, also 2 inches. Actually, I think all these are 2 inches. there was somebody who was swimming out to sea trying to commit suicide after a bout of too much alcohol, and the beach got very activated. And I posed for this photograph, and subsequently this painting grew out of that. Hence all the activity towards out in this sea. This is another self-portrait done more recently, just last year, of me smoking pot in my friend's garage in California, which I'm not a stoner, but it kind of is all about his garage. And I wanted to do a grand still life painting, and his garage was just so much who he was, and all the activity that kind of went on in that garage is something I wanted to kind of treasure. And this is also 2 inches by maybe 2.5, and it's just kind of an intimate, friendly thing. And then these last 2 are kind of a newer body of work that are based on solitary figures. And this is really small, less than 1 inch by inch, and it's of Lenin. And this is the last one. Also, this is about 2 by 2 inches, and this is a portrait of Christopher Reeves. Yeah, that's it, I think.
He's coming back very soon. Well, thank you for showing us your work. I suppose we could talk about the makeup. The makeup of the panel, which, well, there is Alfred Leslie, who came of age, or who began working in the 50s and the 60s, and Joan Semmel, who began painting in the 60s and the 70s, and then Robin Tooze, who began painting in, I suppose, the 70s and the 80s, I mean, you know, roughly, and then James Sheehan in the late 80s and the 90s. And out of each of them come, of course, out of a different context. And I was wondering about the question, why figurative? I mean, why did each of them choose figuration as a vehicle of expression? For someone like Alfred and Joan, they were really, in a way, well, bucking a trend. Abstraction was still pretty dominant, and painting itself would soon be more or less considered, at least not much interest to discuss. So that's, you know, one context. And then Robin comes in, I think, when painting and figuration return to the scene, again, is a kind of maybe critical interest. I mean, not that painting ever died or figurative painting ever did, of course, because there were always painters, but just in terms of watching the cycle of the discourse, as it were. And then, of course, James coming in the 90s, the pluralistic 90s, where it's quite open-ended. So anyway, my question is then, as I started out with, why figurative? And we can take it any way we want, and then maybe work it from there. Would anyone like to begin? I mean, why do you paint figurative? I'm not asking you to explain everything.
Go in order?
All right. Would you like to go, Al?
Well, I started before, so, all right, I will if you want.
No.
I don't know what I'm going to say. I didn't hear what what you had to say at the beginning, but I suppose it was some kind of overview of the so-called situation or figuration, if you want to think of it like that. Anyway, I'm not even sure why I'm here now, but I think that if we separate ourselves as artists from the political situation of what we think of as the art world, everybody has a different story, everybody has a different set of details, which when you examine them, you understand something about their life and their work. And I think that will happen with everybody here, seeing everybody outside of that matrix in which we like to try to stuff everybody in. For myself, at the very beginning, when I was showing you the overview of my work, I pointed out that I was a filmmaker and a painter. And that was the main issue that drove everything in terms of the conflict that I had, which was separate, completely separate from the conflict that existed for the older generation of painters who were my friends at the time in 1947. So for de Kooning and Pollock and Rothko, they had come through all of these issues of whether or not to be figurative or not be a figurative painter, basically through some kind of revelation, almost religious in nature, that they had made some kind of particular kind of discovery, and there was this transformation that occurred in their work if you look at their particular development. Although again, when we pinpoint it and you look at each of them separately, there are much finer shadings that I'm giving you now. But for myself, given my background and my early experiences in the theater, having been exposed to the theater of Erwin Piscator and Bertolt Brecht when I was very, very young, and quite accidentally, and having made films in which I was basically influenced by the Hollywood style and by the Italian neo-realists when they began to appear at the end of World War II. For me, the issue of whether or not I was going to be a figurative painter or an abstract painter never occurred. It just seemed to me at the end of World War II that there was no way for me as an artist or a person to paint pictures of people. For most of us who were there at that time, there was an issue of what was it that an artist was supposed to do, given the conditions of the world as we had just experienced it. And were we going to be sort of people who were making paintings in which the Vanderbilts and the Guggenheims or the Rockefellers would be able to take and hang on their wall, on the walls? Or was there a way in terms of making art that we could have some kind of moral perspective? And from the point of, from a kind of a loose, kind of philosophical point of view, abstraction, to me as a young artist, seemed to me the way that I could deal with the same issues without having to think I was trespassing on the lives of all the people who were killed in World War II. But at the same time, as a filmmaker, I dealt with those issues directly, much in the way that a documentarian would. And it was that conflict that I brought into my work, which solved itself simply by the fact that finally, after 10 years of being in conflict, say between 1947 and 57, I decided that I had to make a distinction between being an artist and a painter, and that if I was going to be a painter, I could just keep painting what I was doing and pay attention to all the kind of decisions that painters have to make. But if I was going to be an artist, I had to take certain kind of risks and open myself up to whatever was going to happen. So it was at that point that I began to make films and take photographs and write again. And at that point, when I began to bring all of those things together, it was at that point that when I started to paint once more, I thought, what I did as a filmmaker, I can do as a painter. And then I just nibbled away and at the body of work that I had created. And bits and pieces, and over a period of about 5 or 6 years, things fell away until I found myself in the curious position that I am now, in which I actually regard myself as an abstract artist, but I paint these representational images. But in the end, I think for all of us as artists, we can think about all of the decisions that we have to make, but eventually that belongs to somebody else. We're workers, basically. We make things, and it's those issues that I think that we have to deal with, basically.
Well, if you haven't seen the show, you should go and see it, because it's, if you haven't seen the show, I'm telling everybody.
Okay.
It's quite an interesting vocation to, or place to see art as a context, and there's a great substantial amount of work that is really fantastic, and I feel very privileged to be a part of it. If the panel is situated in terms of decades, and I'm representing the last, I think I have quite a burden to on my shoulders of trying to make sense of that, of how figuration could actually make sense now. I was kind of raised with television, which is probably a distinct difference. And I think it's through this bombardment of imagery, constantly just kind of taking in information and just kind of trying to kind of access logic from that. I think I've been just kind of stunted into feeling like imagery is just another kind of bit. You know, it's like a tiny little moment of information, and it goes away very quickly. And I think part of what I wanted to get at in painting was to kind of slow that process down and choose imagery very carefully, so that when you entered in, you were not only kind of confronted with an image, which was a very personal and relatively, you know, unconscious reference, but you were also kind of, I try to distill that and take it away from what the obvious is and mold it into like a very abstract experience. And I think drawing my scale down to such a degree was a way of just kind of bringing in a certain type of intimate theater that's very one-to-one. It's about going into something and engaging on a very personal, intimate level. And breaking apart imagery, as I kind of interpret it, is kind of a way to kind of limit or kind of open up the kind of context for how imagery affects us. And the imagery I choose is it's gone through it's a whole formula. I pull images from magazines. I have a large stack of collages that probably are over 1 million or so images, and I kind of take these images, and once you put two images together, it starts to become a narrative of its own. And I try to kind of recontextualize the image over and over again before I choose that image to kind of represent a larger thought process. And that's usually what draws me in. And through that larger process, I try to kind of create the body of like a full idea, and not just the direct context with the image itself. So in that way, I see myself also as an abstract painter, and not directly a figurative painter. But that's a hard thing now, I think, to define yourself so concretely. But I enjoy the figure as a kind of a vehicle for getting into that abstract experience.
I think it's interesting hearing you talk about and where you come from, being part of that world where abstraction was really what was going on, and the given and the ism. And I think I came as a young painter, and the tail end of that kind of hangover. And I've always, the abstract expressionists I think they were like, you know, my inspiration when I was very young. And they were also, it was exciting because it was these American painters and the whole scale of what they did and how they really made art history here in a way that never had happened before. And they were very exciting and inspiring. But even though I feel like my paintings now are about all that. There's a lot of minimalism in it, and there's a lot of abstraction. So I too have fallen into this category where I feel that I'm representational, but I do a lot of everything. It comes from other places too, and that's really in my head and how I work all the time. Back, okay. And so, but when I was lucky enough too for myself to be able to have some freedom, because it was much more open in a way, or maybe because I was much more naive and stupid in my own way, that I always gravitated to working with the figure. When I was in college, I worked abstractly because that's what everyone was doing. It was still, even then, kind of obscure to use the figure or draw and paint in any way like that. But ever since I was a young child, you know, a kid, I used to always was fascinated with imagery and making images and the magic. I'm still enthralled by the magic of making something by a curve in your brush or a paint next to another paint. That's the part of the physicality of the paint that it just enthralls me to no end, that it's just addictive. That to make something look alive or look dead, by the magic, the illusion of it still holds a lot of attraction to me, and and it's a hard thing to do. It's challenging because, for me, because it's not, you get it right or you get it wrong. And when I was working abstractly, it was more for me about the physicality, the sensuality about it, but it didn't satisfy me in another way, which image making does, which was about, like you were saying, we're workers. I feel like that we're in the world, I'm sort of swallowing everything and you see and you feel, and you sort of like this food, you keep swallowing it, and then you kind of vomit it out. That's when you're working. And it's just a collection of ideas and images, and abstract painting, I guess, wasn't, for myself, not enough. I was more interested in the idea or the expression of an idea or a communication of communicating an idea or connecting in some way, or reevaluating something in a different way, or making something look in a way or make you think in a way you've never thought before, more than I was in like the physicality of the paint or the beautiful accident or the strange accident that can happen with abstract work. And it became for me after a while, when I worked like that, when I worked more abstractly, it was more about painting. And there's just so much stuff going on in the world that I wanted to be more direct. I wanted to say something. I wanted to be clear and direct and, just get to the point. And that's connected to what maybe you're saying about being inundated also with TV and images, and what I was saying before about being bombarded with stuff, and there's so much stuff to talk about and sift through. But it's just natural. I just naturally gravitated to it always, and I'll stop now.
Watch this. Well, I think categories are always difficult somehow or other. They tend to undercut what you really mean rather than make them clear. I personally started as an abstract artist. I always considered myself an abstract artist. I still feel like I'm an abstract artist, and yet I'm totally engrossed in doing work with the figure, with the body, with myself, with other people. And the whole idea of abstraction was totally involved, for me anyhow, in process. And the process was enormously engaging and compulsive at the time that we were involved with doing that. When it started to become formulaic, it was time to leave it. When you automatically knew what was expected and what you needed to do to make a painting, it was time to move. And there were, as everyone has said, other things in the world that were very engrossing for us, each of us at different times. When I first came back to New York as an abstract painter who had shown extensively in Europe and South America those enormous abstract paintings, it was a tremendous jump for me to take the risk and do a figurative painting. It was a no-no. You weren't allowed to do that. You weren't supposed to do that. And I looked for a way to use the body, the figure, in a way that would not be what I called academic, because that was the kiss of death, to make an academic painting. And so I moved into things that I felt were as close to me as I could possibly get, literally. And I dealt with the most personal and the most intimate kind of content that I could in an attempt to break down all of those barriers. And in so doing, I found imagery that was meaningful for me and for other people who were also involved in that same moment of time where those issues that were personal to me were really issues that had a reach that went further than the personal, that became political issues also. And so that was how I got into the kind of work I was doing. There was no pre-planning. It was an organic process. And through it all, I always entertained the same love of the paint, of the process, that I did during the time when I was making totally abstract paintings. But what's interesting to me now about this whole idea of, for instance, the show in Snug Harbor, where you have all these different people working with figuration, and they have been and still are, and probably always will be, all working at different times. And why the figure now? Well, the figure is always there. Why not now? And it's always happening. It's just what is at a particular moment, the buzzwords that are being promoted. That doesn't mean that that work isn't still happening. And how all of that work in that show jostles each other and makes a conversation with each other. Even works that happen at very different times still have something to say to each other. And that's really interesting, and it's what keeps us all going. I see artists, very young artists, working with ideas that I was maybe working with back then, and we recognize each other in the work, that there are certain commonalities that we pick up and then we lose, and then we pick up again at another time with perhaps a slightly different character, but nevertheless with the same kind of energy. And all of that is what makes the whole engagement with painting so very interesting for us all, I think.
Well, there's only one person here who talks about the mimetic qualities at all. I mean, directly. I mean, is Robin likes the magic, she said, of the image, and the rest of you are abstract painters. So that's wonderful. No, well, or you don't not consider yourself an abstract painter. Okay.
No, I think what brought me personally back to working with the figure was the need for the image, the desire for the image to say something that I wanted to talk about that went beyond just the paint, that I wanted very badly to express certain ideas that had to do with my real experience in the world. And the image was essential to that. And I thought of the image as the driving force in all of that work. When I say I was I'm an abstract painter, I mean it metaphorically, in the sense that I think abstractly and conceptually, even though I'm working with the figure. I don't think I'm working the figure. But I'm very, very centered on the image and what it communicates and what it means in the world and what it is that I'm trying to do with that image in the world. And so that's the kind of thing that drives the work. So it's not figure, but it's image, it's intent and content and context.
Well, does anyone want to add to that?
I thought it was interesting when you were talking about you felt abstraction was becoming formulated and academic, and that's such a recognizable buzzword for painters. And there is I think that's intriguing, and because there is sort of and has been, maybe it's changing, I don't know, but there has always been some kind of a resistance to the image, and what, that's curious to me. What is that about? Is that about, it seems like I grew up thinking that the only kind of paintings that were real paintings had to be large, using a lot of paint, and it was all about the physicality of the paint and the expression of a stroke, and that's to say that a painting is just one thing is just crap. It's that, and it's a lot of other things too. But there's always been some resistance to paintings on a different scale, that it's not connected about the physicality of the paint and image making, and it's interesting. I don't know if it's some kind of a fear of being exposed or vulnerable, or it's hanging on to what we grew up on to believe in this country, sort of a national pride about abstract expressionism. But I think that was the interesting thing about pluralism. It was the beginning of trying to open up the dialogue about it, embracing it all. And now it's that sort of it's something sifting through that funnel, that funnel, and it's a curious time.
Yes, but do you think that's still an issue, though, this divide between figuration and abstraction? Does it still continue to be an issue? And I could address that to James, because...
Well, I think Al said a good thing when you talked about that distinction between being a painter and an artist. When I see art, I like to go into a gallery and just have it kind of take me to another place. I kind of want it to knock my socks off and just totally engross me. What that is distinctly is probably something very unconscious, but at the same time conceptual in regards to what's happening in the world, the political environment, your personal, where you are and where you're living. And I think that's all a great part of taking into the work when you go, whether it's kind of an abstract sense or a very kind of figurative narrative sense. I feel like I work in both ways, and to me, an image that's very representational has a very great charge to it as a very abstract sensibility. And so I like to kind of challenge both ends. Of course, I'm kind of criticized because it's really formal painting. It's very straight. It's the space is real, and I'm very happy with that, because I think that's the thing that gives it the thump. When it's really hitting right, the space is real, and then you're engaged with something that's not quite perfect. And that distinction, when things are kind of off a little bit, is exciting to me, and that's kind of what I look for in a painting. As a figuration painter, that's just my history, and I grew up out of the Bay Area figurative artists like David Park and Diebenkorn, and I went to Berkeley, and so Hans Hofmann was kind of my god when I was there, and so I was drawing things in between, David Park using very goopy paint, and Hofmann just playing with this whole optical field thing. And to me, that was like really engaging, and I always wanted to just kind of fill it in and just make that experience real. And so I'm kind of engaged with painting. Yeah.
I think, I mean, we've all been talking about abstraction and representation, but I think at the same time, everyone in the audience may not realize that we also know that all of the so-called abstract works that we see are also forms of representation. So we can recall seeing, for example, the beautiful works, the early works of Don Judd in his stacked boxes, and it's just a matter of that it may not be representational of a figure necessarily, but it is representational of a human experience which people have. So you can look at them, and then if you wanted to piss Donald off, you could say it looked like mailboxes on a corner in, on the Lower East Side late at night or something like that, with all the shadows that they threw. But I think that the beautiful scatter pieces, say, of Carl Andres, and being able to stand in front of any of the black paintings of Ad Reinhardt are, to me, as important and consequential as the experiences I have when I look at a painting that has something that is supposedly figurative in terms of its representation. And I think that there's always been, not as much as we have pointed out in different ways here, of a separation between all those things. And I think that maybe we need to reaffirm that, so we don't sound that we are like we are enemies of the abstractionists and the so-called non-figural artists.
Yeah, I mean, we all, no, I don't, yeah, that's not, because I think we all come from there, learn from there, are part of it, and still are. But the art world does tend to sort of separate and try to isolate it, and
It's categorized.
and yeah.
Well, it's a natural impulse to categorize,
Yeah.
though.
Yeah,
Well,
and then there was the period of minimalism, which was the attempt to try to get away from any figure which is abstract, as you said, and representational. So there's always this kind of a back and forth ping-pong dialogue game about image making, whether it's abstract, minimal, and it's interesting the way we're sort of obsessed with ourselves and can't get away from ourselves, and it's about the same thing. Even this dialogue it's all connected to the same form.
Well, I just would sort of like to raise from that, because it has to do probably with my own process, the whole idea of the influence of the media and photo in relationship to painting, and how that has changed how we think about painting now. And I think that that's had an enormous influence. The whole idea of an image and how easy it is to make an image in the media, so to speak, to just capture the image with a click. And then why does one need to make an image with another kind of a process? So that's something else that comes into play, I think, at this time in relationship to what we all do and why we do it. And I know I personally fought for a long time. The whole idea of making an image from a photo back then was considered strictly not permitted. It was cheating. And now, of course, if one makes an image that doesn't come from a photo, or from the media in some way, it's considered old-fashioned. So we're caught in this kind of strange process of constantly changing means, and yet we all have the impulse and the desire and the need to recreate that process in other ways. And we all do it each in our own way. but the category of figuration, perhaps, at this time is not precisely the way one categorizes oneself as an artist. It's a formulation that comes out of that other period of when abstraction was breaking the rules by making work that was not, quote, representational.
Yeah, but the categories of art far preceded, I mean, the 1950s. I mean, in the 1850s, you know, you had actually the categories. You know, it's landscape and figurative painting or history painting was at the top, and all of the others were scaled down. So all of these issues are the issues that we are artists talking about our art, and then there are the people who are essentially what I consider the outsiders. That is to say, not our audience, but basically the so-called art critics and the people who are observers and who need to categorize us in order to be able to carry on a dialogue, not with us, but with other art critics.
Exactly.
So you get into that kind of situation, and we, in the sense, then become the victims, and we're always trying to struggle to say, this is shit. This is not the me you're talking about. This is your perception and a notion that you have that you want to push forward. I mean, if we want to look at understanding the breaking down and of space and everything else, we have to look at Ezra Pound. And if you read the cantos in Pound and you talk about displacement and collage and multiple voices, and then if you think of it 50 years later in Glenn Gould, you know, when he's begin to tamper with collaging tapes together, when it was unheard of to tamper with the idea of a full performance on tape. You know, we have over 100 years of people finally coming to grips to understand that this is actually all a very, very old-fashioned idea. And I think it was, who was it, the composer that used to live in the Chelsea Hotel, who wrote the three...
Virgil Thompson.
Virgil Thompson, in a book that he wrote sometime in 1932 or 1935, in 1935 he said everything that it was done already in 1900. And essentially I think that's where the ground was broken, and everything that all of us are doing, separate in all of who we are in the streams, the way we think about things and the way we make things, is just different people, different times, different cultures.
Well, it speaks about how art history is made, how it's recorded, and who's recording it, and the illusion of these kind of movements and these isms. I remember when energism was being pushed down our throats as some kind of a movement, and we watched it try to live or die, but it also affects the artists, because artists kind of, I mean, the best place to be is like to step out of it in some way and just do what you need to do. You know, do what you have to from your gut, and try to stay away from all the noise or all the pressure about what is in style now. It's awful, you know, and it really does affect you. You have to just stay away from it all, and just, the only reason why you're doing it is because you need to do it. Otherwise, don't do it, because you could do something else and make a better living and be just as happy. But if that's your job and that's what you got to do, do it, and that's what, and, you know, and don't listen to anything else. And the best, I think, work comes out of that. Whether it's recorded, whether we know about it historically is another story, because that's the part of the problem here. It's a small group of people who have galleries, or collectors who buy work, who listen to the galleries, and then that hence gets the small group of work that gets reviewed, and that's the work that gets bought and seen and recorded in history books, and it's an illusion, because we're all connected to the same thing. We've all been doing all different kinds of work, but artists get affected by it.
They do, but history is also an illusion, because the art remains, and then the way it's looked at gets revised, but the object is then reinterpreted and then placed into a different cultural context. I notice it's getting late, and I'm just wondering if there are some questions from the audience that perhaps we can throw it to you. I just think that a few of you are being very hard on critics, and I have to defend them a little bit. You know, speaking as the only I'm not the enemy either, but
necessary too. It's all necessary.
but it's all it's a synthesis, and the point of view is developed, you know, out of the synthesis. And I suppose the real question, though, if there's such a thing, the real question I wanted to know is perhaps, you know, is there a difference in thinking between, back to the word again, a figurative artist and a non-figurative artist? For example, we really haven't talked about the fact that a lot of abstract artists, in quotes, think they're much more real than the figurative because they're not representing anything. It's, you know, a direct presentation of the materials of paint, and that's what you can respond to. So the question is, as I said, is there a difference in thinking, in degree, in whatever way, between a figurative and a non-figurative painter? I mean, these are the idea of categories, but then there are ideas of communities, and then this idea of imagined communities, because we can build a community, or we can break it down depending, you know, on what level I want to approach it.
Well, I think that artists have the impulse to make work, and that impulse comes from their life view and their positioning of themselves in the world. And so you can have an activist artist, for instance, who's really interested in changing the world, who's making works that are, you know, like paint just being tossed in all different kinds of directions, and is making a particular kind of critical statement by the very act and the very gesture of doing something like that, and depending, of course, in what context that person is doing it. So it isn't that a figurative person thinks differently than a non-figurative person. It's just that we all use different kinds of instruments to make our will enter into that dialogue with the world. And sometime you'll use a photograph for it, sometimes you'll use a painting, sometimes you'll use a film, sometimes you'll use a figure, and sometimes you'll use a schmear. What's the difference? The difference is the way you try to interact with that world out there. So the fact that at one time I will use the figure to do that, because at that moment it might be that the impact of that particular image is more effective for me than by making just the mark. But the thinking behind both is the same.
I think that's an interesting question. I don't know. Maybe there is a difference between it. It makes me think of the viewer and what are we doing? Why are we doing what we're doing? And when some artists are interested in making images to sort of say something and to release something. But then when we see that image on the wall versus an abstract or representational piece, what is the ultimate desire to make you feel you can transcend your own experience and see something or feel something else? So it's about the ultimate end of it too, and what the viewer feels.
I just have a quick story. I recently had a residency up at the World Trade Center, and I was on the 91st floor, and they had an open studio event where there was a good 600 people came through and saw my work. And I have to say, like 1 out of every 10 people I talked to asked me what kind of software I used to manipulate an image over to that kind of surface. And I was kind of baffled by that, but they're very serious. And I know we're living in very different times when I have to explain that I developed my own software, and it's, you know, it's a trade secret, and I'm not going to tell anybody how I did it. But
well, I don't know. I guess the only thing that had occurred to me to say to respond to your question was that as many different people as there are to make things, that's as many different ways that they interpret what it is that's about to happen. You ask, you know, is there a different way of thinking? Well, I mean, you're making such a broad generalization, which in a sense, it could be fun to try to answer it. But the real issue as painters that we're talking about, I think, is that every different artist wrestles with it in their own way. And the greatest things that I think, although I say all these things about critics, about my conflict with them, is that I think the greatest thing for critics to do is to tell us what they experience and what they feel, and that the people who are supposed to pose the questions are the artists, and the questions are posed in their work, and it's for the critic to deliver us how they experience it. And that's what I think it's about.
Well, as a critic, I feel that there are those painters who paint, and then there are those painters who paint plus, you know, so something like that. Are there any questions from? I think we should, you know, draw to an end. But if there's some questions,
just, you know, picking up on what you said about what's going on today and all of the multimedia issues that confront us. My question is, how do we validate something that's been validated for centuries, and that is working with pigment and working, you know, by hand? I think that's a challenge that all of us have, because everyone wants to think that way, because that's what that makes all the sense in the world when you think of what's available.
Right. Yeah, I think it's kind of a bold, kind of innovative thing to use actual paint with a stick with little hairs on the end of it with your arm. I think that's now becoming a novelty, because I see fewer and fewer painters of my contemporaries, at least painters that are kind of willing to go through this arduous 10-year process before anything really happens. I think what I see just around me is kind of the lure of the technology being able to kind of communicate things really quickly. So I think that's why we see a lot in our galleries of computer-related art, big blown-up photographs, which can be very interesting if it's, you know, used in the context of an art experience. But as far as that kind of transcendent going into a painting and enjoying paint for itself is getting rare, and so I feel like it's kind of on a few of our shoulders to kind of keep that going and being able to kind of strive with that. Yeah, there's no validating it at all. It's really an art experience, and it's just one tool, you know. And so developing my own software is a completely legitimate reason for why I do what I do. And so the dialogue has changed. There's no difference. It's just you know, where you go and how you engage.
Yeah, but also I think that the reason also to do it is that every child wants to do it, and every kid wants to make a mark with paint. They love it. And that tells you something, that we need it in some way. And that's why we do it.
Well, it's not that the question is more sort of a statement. Because I'm listening to you talking about, you know, your involvement with the paint and also with the images, and I think you already answered Lily's question about what's different between a figurative painter and just a painter who just schmears. And recently I read a review online of Jenny Seville's exhibition that was last year at the Gagosian Gallery, which I went to, and I noticed that there was definitely a very palpable atmosphere of attention, not only because the paintings were so huge, but because they were these very skillful, pretty consummate paintings of, not conventionally attractive bodies. And I read this review, and I was kind of miffed when the reviewer said, these are not about realism. And I get a little annoyed at this avoidance of, they're not abstract paintings. If she wanted to make an abstract painting, she could have made a fantastic gestural painting, because they are very gestural. But somehow, what she's interested in is turning those gestures into flesh. And I think that's probably the fundamental, to me anyway, the fundamental distinction, that, for Robert Ryman, it's enough to manipulate material within a limited sort of format, and, it's all about material and sort of some kind of essence, because he chooses these limitations. And for someone like you, Joan, I think it's not just about the manipulation of material, it's manipulating that material into an image that we recognize as ourselves. And I think that's why a figure painter paints figures, and it's, I think, a little disingenuous to say that it's not about realism or it's not different than abstraction. I think it is in a significant way.
Well, in the realist sense, Courbet is my god. So I'll just put that. He's the one I look to and in some terms try to emulate. So the distinction of the category of realist, I would not feign at all, because I consider that kind of the Courbet moment as being the moment when modernism really began. And I think it began with the idea of taking the figure and kind of just distorting the sense of our history with it. And so I don't think you can deny the fact that all art kind of deals with a certain sense of realism. But yeah, it's a loaded word, and it's probably used incorrectly a lot. But I would love to consider myself a realist painter in that regard. I just think abstractly. So that's my context for, yeah.
I'd like to thank Lilly Wei and the members of our panel, and thank you all for being here.